So perhaps part of the reason why this is harder to see using just simple terminology is because Marx really had it very simplistically laid out in terms of this class, and they're in opposition with one another. And that's not really necessarily the way things work, especially today. And Max Weber was critical of Marx's simplistic view of this, and actually said that there were three factors that sort of interwove to create class identity and the social economic stratification system. And that was wealth, which is really what Marx was focusing on, was capital, right? But also power and prestige. And these sorts of things bring in a much more complex cultural array of interactions that take place. So somebody who doesn't make a lot of money but is an artist could actually be participating in the sort of social realms of the elite, the bourgeoisie. But they don't make a lot of money, but they're prestigious. Also, someone who's very powerful but doesn't necessarily make a lot of money, like a politician or a lobbyist, might also be hobnobbing with the wealthiest people in the world. And in fact, the wealthiest people in the world might not find it enough to just have money. They might also want power and prestige, and they might want to participate in the worlds of other people as well. So it's a far more complicated situation than even Marx had considered. And that's even further complicated by the fact that we don't now live in just one social system. We live in a global system that interacts together across the world. So let's go back to that global system and talk about colonialism and how the European colonial powers started to interact with the areas, the zones, the geographical regions that they were starting to extend their empire and their power into. And this is called colonialism. That's the political, social, economic, and cultural domination of a territory and its people by a foreign power for an extended period of time. That is colonialism. Imperialism is slightly different, and that's been around for far, far longer. As long as states have been around, imperialism is the rule of one nation or empire over other foreign nations or empires. So that's really just political. But colonialism is domination of another territory at a distance by a foreign power that infiltrates their political, social, cultural aspects as well. So British colonialism was concentrated, let's start with British colonialism, in the New World, West Africa, and India. Their first wave of colonialism was to some of these big ticket places. And they stayed there for many, many years. And in fact, while Britain doesn't have as many colonies as they once had, and in fact, this has been really replaced by what they call the Commonwealth, which these are independent nations that still sort of exist in the post-colonial mindset. We'll come to post-colonialism in a moment. And a second wave of post-colonialism, Britain expanded even farther than just those big three big ticket items, which India. They were still in India. They went to Australia, New Zealand, Canada, parts of Asia, and large portions of Eastern and Southern Africa. And this was accompanied not just by the desire to economically exploit these places and use their labor, and in fact, economists, when referring to that little thing I said about those, where does increase in value come from? By taking things from somebody else and selling them at a profit. Well, the economists have referred to this in terms of colonialism as a giant sucking sound that comes from these peripheral areas in world systems theory. So these colonies that I've just said, the New World, North and South America, West Africa, India, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, Asia, Africa, these were all places that Britain was sucking the resources out, bringing them into the core in Britain, pumping them through factories, creating finished products that they then sold at home, and then back to the peripheral regions at a profit, at a higher price. So, and sometimes using slave labor or cheap labor in the process, exploiting people all the way. And so these factory owners were taking things from the natural resources from locations that didn't used to belong to them, from countries that they colonized, took those natural resources away from them, and then sold them back to their original, where the raw materials came from, at a higher price. So that is that giant sucking sound coming from exploiting the periphery, going into the core, enriching the core, and then impoverishing the peripheral regions. Now, this seems bad, and it is. I think there's really no way to sugarcoat the way I'm explaining this to you. But at the time, how could you, as a human being, go to sleep at night knowing that you were doing this to people? Well, this is where ideology comes in and helps you live with yourself. And in the case of British colonialism, there was a phrase called "white man's burden" that the poet Rudyard Kipling actually used and wrote about as a way to justify this situation. And it's paternalistic. So very, like I know what is best for you, and it's very racist. This doctrine asserts that native peoples were not capable of governing themselves and needed the white British colonialists to maintain them and provide their order. In France, they were a little bit later than Britain to start colonizing extensively. But it was mainly missionary work, but after the French Revolution in 1789, the state started to really get involved. The state of France started to really push for expansion, and the first phase of colonial efforts in France were Canada, the Louisiana Territory, the Caribbean, and some parts of India. And in the second phase of French colonialism, they started to focus their attention really more on North Africa and Indochina. And they had a similar sort of a justification, which they called mission civilisatrice, which is similar to the white man's burden in Britain. But it was very pointedly cultural, that they wanted to spread French culture, language, religion, specifically Roman Catholicism, throughout the colonies. And they saw this as their moral duty to spread Frenchness in this way. And they had both indirect rule, where they let native populations govern themselves through maybe some intermediaries of some French liaisons, but they had native political structures and leaders that they were allowed to maintain and intact. And they also had direct rule, which was the practice of imposing new governments upon native populations that often were French people that were implanted there. The French took a sort of a different approach to colonialism, and they saw it more as an empire extension, a territory expansion than Britain did. Britain really viewed these colonies as outposts to some extent, and as an island nation, as the United Kingdom was, they saw themselves as sort of seafarers that went around the world and were connected by a web of nodes, and those nodes were access points to go into the interior of Africa or the interior of North America and exploit those, and then come bring that back to the UK. Whereas France saw, when they conquered an area, that whole territory was theirs, that was their land, that they wanted to Frenchify. And so, for instance, in the second wave of French colonialism, from about 1870 up to World War II, North Africa and Indochina were really considered to be France itself. And North Africa in particular, Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria, these were French. This was French land. It was only separated by a small body of water. You could think of it as a lake, crossing the lake from one part of France, from Marseille, down to Algiers, and you were still in France, right? You were just crossing the Mediterranean, but you were still in France. So France saw this more as a territorial expansion, whereas Britain tended to see this in more economic terms. Where these core colonial European powers came into contact with the peripheral colonized countries, there was inevitably some sort of disruptions and changes to the identity and the ways of life of those people. Sometimes severely disrupted and reordered by colonialism. Also, just the concept of geopolitical distinctions and your ethnicity and that sort of thing was completely restructured under colonialism. And so colonialism took the world and just shook it up and changed it. What was once a down-the-line contact now became contacting little nodes all over the world to these central core areas. And after the colonies were founded, started to progress, and eventually most colonies gained independence at some point. The study of this process and becoming a post-colony is what we call post-colonial studies. And it's both the period succeeding colonialism and also the positions that were taken during imperialism and Eurocentrism. And so post-colonies and post-colonial studies can be broken down into what kind of colony are we talking about? Was it one where there was a settler population, where France sent a bunch of people into this country and changed the makeup of who was living in this place? Was it non-settler population, where it was just sort of a hands-off approach and we own you, but we'll let you carry on the way you've been? Or is it mixed, somewhere in between these things? So settler populations you can think of as like a good example of that's Australia. Australia is European Australians far outnumber native Australians, the indigenous populations that are there. And so Australia is a vastly settler dominant population in the modern post-colonial situation. But places like India they don't have large numbers of European colonists that still live in India. It's dominated by native Indians that lived in India before colonies and so native Indians, and only a small number of Europeans that are holdovers from the colonial periods, and then mixed colonies like South Africa is a good example of a mixed post-colony where there's both sizable native and European populations. And so anthropologists break these down because the social dynamics in each of these situations is obviously going to be very different. Now, bringing us up into the modern world, how did these, especially in post-colonial studies, how did development take place? How are we still living in this sort of core periphery, semi-periphery organization? To some extent, yes. But there's also been, whenever a colony was set up, there was some sort of a philosophy, some sort of an economic development plan or intervention philosophy. So, White Man's Burden and Mission Civilisatrice are examples of that intervention philosophy. But also in terms of things like, when you go in, do you start to industrialize and modernize and westernize these countries that you're coming in contact to? How do you change that? And sometimes that can be considered to be desirable. Sometimes that can be something that's to be avoided. The one global phenomenon that's taken off that we find ourselves in terms of world economy is what's called neoliberalism. And neoliberalism is kind of the exact opposite of what you tend to think of as liberal in politics in this country, where liberal, socially progressive and that sort of thing. Neoliberalism is actually it doesn't usually associate itself with left-wing policies. In fact, it's largely railed against by left-wing people with left-wing politics, and tends to be more embraced by the right wing. Neoliberalism specifically refers to a concept that was first founded by Adam Smith in his very famous economic work, The Wealth of Nations. It basically says, it defines the wealth of nations. Adam Smith's model defines the way economies work. The hidden hand, that desires for certain things go through these waves. It's part of human nature, and that buying and selling, supply and demand, should be allowed to sort of have a life of its own, to breathe and expand and contract on its own. So this is what's considered to be free trade, right? And Adam Smith's neoliberalism is the liberal in that, which means free, is referring to trade, free trade, with no government restrictions on manufacture or things like putting pollutants in the water, no barriers to commerce, no tariffs. That provides the best way for a nation to develop an economy. And so this has been used as an intervention strategy. And some very powerful international bodies have been promoting this for developing nations, for post-colonial nations, saying you must or you should participate in this neoliberalist type of economy. So they say, for instance, like the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, they have restrictions on who they will loan money to. They say you must, in order if you want to obtain a loan, you have to accept these neoliberal premises that deregulation will lead to economic growth. And there's a lot of money at stake, and so developing nations, they either have to turn down this money or they have to embrace free trade. And what does that free trade do? That mainly benefits the people that already have the capital, the formerly colonialist, formerly controlling countries. So some of these things have sort of the flip, some of these free trade ideas have the sort of flip side of what you might expect. So something like NAFTA, which is just recently in the process of being replaced by some NAFTA part 2, I guess, I can't remember the name of it. But NAFTA was a North American free trade agreement which was trying to create free trade between Mexico, Canada, and the United States. Sounds great, right? Everybody can trade freely. But Mexico in particular was supporting small-scale farmers through subsidies. And NAFTA said, nope, that's not free trade, you're tipping the balance. NAFTA, which is a neoliberalist policy, said, no, you have to level the playing field and let the markets decide. So free trade, no government intervention. Mexico, in order to have this open market to the United States, pulled their subsidies from small-scale farmers and put them out of business. So what happens when you have a bunch of small-scale farmers that have nowhere to go? They migrate to America and they work on American farms, big factory farms. And so a lot of the migration that you see coming from labor migrations coming from Mexico into America are the result of one of these free trade agreements, or at least in part. So it has some of the sort of the opposite of effects that you might expect to happen. And we should, so what's the alternative to neoliberalism and free trade? Well, there have been a few. Communism is one of them. Communism with a lowercase c, as a concept, is something that Karl Marx talked about. And this is a social system in which the property is owned by the community, the proletariat, not the bourgeoisie, where people work for the common good. It sounds like a great idea. But in implementation, communism with a capital C was a political movement and doctrine which overthrew capitalism and formed a state-run ownership of the means of production. So rather than the people owning it, the state owned their production. And this resulted in something that Karl Marx never would have signed off on, which was communist systems tended to be, in practice, authoritarian and oftentimes totalitarian governments. They monopolized all power, all production. Everything was highly centralized and strictly disciplined. And rather than private ownership, everything was owned. The nation itself, the state, owned the means of production. And so that was an option, and there are still some communist countries that exist. But Russia, in fact, anthropologists and sociologists tend to call these things more of a form of socialism than communism, because they're not really what Karl Marx had spelled out in communism. And but in terms of Soviet Union collapsing, they were increasingly coming under pressure. A series of disruptions in their declines in their GDP, average life expectancy, birth rate, and increased poverty. What they had done was communized poverty in Soviet Union, and it was had become a bubble that was waiting to collapse, which eventually did. All right, well, that's it for this chapter. Pick you up next time.